Welcome to Gemara Academy. In this class, we will learn Tesis Dibra Maschel, Zarak v'nochal gabe ziz kol shehu Rebbe Mechayev. Let's begin. Zarak v'nochal gabe ziz kol shehu Rebbe Mechayev. Here in the Gemara, we had a question. Why in our Mishnah are the onion balabayas chayev for the malacha of Eitzah or achnasa if in each and every case either the akira was done from the hand of the other person or the hanacha was done into the hand of the other person, and the hand of a person is less than 4 tefachim by 4 tefachim. So first we presented the answer of Rabbah, who said, Hamani Rabbi Akiva, that our Mishnah follows the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, who holds that one doesn't need 4 tefachim by 4 tefachim for the akira and the hanacha, and we refuted that answer. And now we presented the answer of Rabbi Yosef, who said, Hamani Rebbe, that who is the author of our Mishnah? It's Rebbe. That Rebbe is of the opinion that we don't need 4 tefachim by 4 tefachim for the akira and the hanacha. The Gemara then went on to explain that regardless of which Rebbe Rav Yosef was possibly referring to, we're not going to accept the answer. And we started off with the first case that he was possibly referring to, which is Zarak v'noch al gabe ziz kol shehu Rebbe Mechayev, that if a person threw an item 4 amos and rishus harabim, and it landed on a ziz kol shehu, a small area, a small protrusion, Rebbe says that he's chayev. So we see that it's not necessary for the hanacha to be on an area that's 4 by 4. So we could say that Rebbe is the author of our Mishnah, that our Mishnah also is of the opinion that we don't need an area of 4 by 4 for the akira and the hanacha. Tosfos is going to ask one question, he's going to answer it, but that's going to lead into a much bigger question, and he's going to give 2 answers to that bigger question. Let's begin. And if one asks, Akati tikshalach, you can still ask. It should still be a question to you. Dilma hanacha hu delay baya. Maybe it's hanacha that doesn't need an area that's 4 by 4. Ha akira baya, but akira does need. From the case of Rebbe, we only see that the hanacha doesn't need an area that's 4 by 4, but we have no information about the akira. And we know that Rav Yosef agrees that although we might not need an area of 4 by 4 for the hanacha, it doesn't necessarily mean that we don't need it for the akira. How do we know that Rav Yosef also agrees with this? Because earlier we presented the answer of Rabbah, who says that our Mishnah follows Rabbi Akiva, who says we don't need an area of 4 by 4 for the hanacha or the akira, and we said maybe it's only the hanacha. Rabbi Akiva only speaks about the hanacha, not the akira. Now, if Rav Yosef agreed that with Rabbah, that if the hanacha doesn't need the area of 4 by 4, it also applies to the akira, then he would have agreed with Rabbah that our Mishnah is authored by Rabbi Akiva. From the fact that he agrees with us that it does not follow Rabbi Akiva shows that he agrees with our question, that although the hanacha might not need an area that's 4 by 4, the akira might need an area that's 4 by 4. So that being the case, it's obvious that not only we won't accept this answer of Rebbe, but also that Rabbi Yosef would not be referring to this case. Because in this case, all we see is that the hanacha doesn't need an area of 4 by 4, but we have no information about the akira. So the Gemara could have asked this question, which not only would indicate why we don't accept the answer, but also that Rabbi Yosef was certainly not referring to that case. Says Tosfos, we could answer the balav hachi, that without this question, parach shaper, we ask, well, even in theory, if we would say whatever applies to the hanacha applies to the akira, we're able to still refute this as a source for our Mishnah. Like the Gemara continued and said that that's referring to a special case of a tree that was in Rishus HaYachid and the branch was in the Rishus HaRabim. And the question is, does the branch follow the tree and receive the size of Dalet al Dalet? So Tosfos is basically saying that although that question in a way is stronger in the sense that not only we won't accept it, but also that Rav Yosef is not referring to that case, but our question without this asks, well, even if we don't have to bring out the distinction between akira and hanacha, we still have a good question. Aval kasha, however, this leads to a question, Tosfos says. Aval kasha, but it's difficult. The Sfarim, the Garsi, according to the Gemaras that have the Girsa, Lekaman Bazarik later on in Perak Hazerik, Al Milsa de Rav Yehuda, on the words of Rav Yehuda, the Amr Basamach that he says nearby, in the next few lines of the Gemara, Mechayev Haya Rebbe Stein, that Rebbe was Mechayev too. Later on, the Gemara presents the second case, which Rav Yosef might have been referring to, and that's the case where Rebbe says that if a person throws an item from one Rishus HaRabim to another Rishus HaRabim through a Rishus HaYachid, Rebbe says that he's Chayev. And Rav Yehuda, we need to pay attention that it's Rav Yehuda, because later in a moment we're going to introduce Rebbe Yehuda as well. And Rav Yehuda says, Mechayev Hoya Rebbe Shtayim, that Rebbe says that the person is Chayev too. Achas Mishum Hachnasa, one for Hachnasa, it went into the Rishus HaYachid, Achas Mishum Eitzah, and one for Eitzah when it went out to the Rishus HaRabim. So we wanted to prove from there that not the hanacha or the akira need an area that's 4 by 4. Now later on, the Gemara in Hazerik has a discussion about this case, and this is what it says. The Gemara says, on the words of Rav Yehuda that said that Rebbe is mechayev too. V'yosef Rav Chisda sat down. V'kakashal, and he had a question. L'meimer the mechayev Rebbe. Are you telling me that Rebbe makes chayev a tulda on a tulda b'mokim av in the place of an avachulu? We know that Rebbe says that if a person does an av and it's tulda, he is only chayev one chiyuv, one carbon chatas. So how could Rav Yehuda say that Rebbe was mechayev too if this is a case of an av and a tulda? We have the hitzah, which is the av, and the hachnasa into the Rosh Hashanah, which is a tulda. So Rav Chisda asked, how could Rav Yehuda say that mechayev hoya Rebbe shtayim if Rebbe would not be mechayev too, since it's a case of tulda b'makom av? Amar leya Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef responded to Rav Chisda, and it's the same Rav Yosef as our Gemara. Mar, you Rav Chisda ad Rebbe masnilo, you learned the teaching of Rav Yehuda on what Rebbe said. V'kashle, therefore you have a question. You learned that Rav Yehuda was saying that Rebbe is mechayev too. Therefore, now you have a question that Rebbe is not mechayev. Atulda b'makom av. Anan, but I or we are the Rebbe Yehuda masnin on law. We learn it on Rebbe Yehuda. We don't learn that when Rav Yehuda said he's mechayev too, he was referring to the case of Rebbe. When Rav Yehuda said he was mechayev too, he was referring to the case of Rebbe Yehuda. L'divrei Rebbe Yehuda, according to the opinion of Rebbe Yehuda, the Omer that says that the person's chayev beis is chayev too. The case of Rebbe Yehuda is if an individual throws an item from Rosh Hashanah into the Rosh Hashanah and it traveled in the Rosh Hashanah 4 amas, Rebbe Yehuda says that the person is chayev. Says Rav Yosef, to that, Rav Yehuda taught mechayev hayashtayim. When he says chayev, he means he's chayev too. He's chayev one chiyuv for throwing from Rosh Hashanah into the Rosh Hashanah, and the second chiyuv because it traveled dalad amas, 4 amas in the Rosh Hashanah. Of all the Rebbe, but according to Rebbe, loy mechayev beis. He's not mechayev the person 2 things. The loy mechayev Rebbe atulda b'makom av, because Rebbe is not make one chayev for a tulda in the place of the av. So this is all in purple because it's the background information. Tosfos began by saying it's difficult. He presents the background information, and now he's going to actually tell us the question. Im kain, if so, mat tiritz Rav Yosef. What is Rav Yosef answering? Hamani Rebbe. This is the opinion of Rebbe. In other words, Tosfos is telling us, once we established at the beginning of Tosfos that Rav Yosef was not referring to the first case, because the first case only gives us information about the Hanocha, not the Akira. And we explained that Rav Yosef agrees that although we might know that the Hanocha doesn't need Dalad al Dalad, it doesn't reflect on the Akira. So Rav Yosef could not have been referring to that case. And now we just presented a Gemara that indicates that Rav Yosef could not have been either referring to the second case, when the person threw it from the Rosh Hashanah to another Rosh Hashanah through the Rosh Hashanah, because Rav Yosef holds that Rebbe was not Mechayev 2 for the Hanocha and the Akira. He's only Mechayev 1. So Rav Yosef could not have been referring to the first case. He could not have been referring to the second case. So what's the Gemara saying when we're trying to figure out which case Rav Yosef is referring to? He's clearly not referring to any of these. Akati Tiksha, we still have our original question. If it's not referring to the second case, regarding the first case, we only see that the Hanocha doesn't in the area that's Dalad Dalad. We don't see about the Akira. So to explain the question briefly and to summarize it, it comes out that Rav Yosef, when he said Hamani Rebbe, and we said which Rebbe, let's look at the cases of Rebbe and we'll show you why we don't accept this answer. We present cases of Rebbe that Rav Yosef was clearly not referring to. He's not referring to the first case because the first case only has an indication of the Hanocha, not the Akira. And Rav Yosef agrees that when we have information about the Hanocha, it does not reflect on the Akira. So he could not have been referring to that case. And it cannot have been referring to the second case, since Rav Yosef holds that in that case, Rebbe was not Mechayev a person 2 chiyuvim, but rather only 1. So we don't see from there about the Hanocha and the Akira either. So Tosfos is going to give 2 answers. One is to show us that he could be referring to the first case, when the person threw it v'noch al gabe ziz kol shehu, and it could be referring to the second case, when he threw it from one Rosh Hashanah to another through the Rosh Hashanah. Let's see the 2 answers. V'yeshlemer, we can answer. The Savar Rav Yosef, the Rav Yosef holds the Dafka Akluta de Rabbi Akiva. That's specifically on the Kluta case of Rabbi Akiva, the Leka Hanocha Klal, that there is no Hanocha whatsoever. We could ask Akira Boya that the Akira needs an actual area of Dalad al Dalad. What Tosfos is saying over here is that we said at the beginning of Tosfos, we established that Rav Yosef certainly agrees that if we have information about the Hanocha, it doesn't reflect on the Akira. And how did we prove that? Because if he held that whatever we see for the Hanocha applies to the Akira, then he would have agreed with Rabbah that our Mishnah is authored by Rabbi Akiva. He should have agreed with him instead of saying an alternative explanation. Says Tosfos, that's not necessarily the case. It could be, and we have to say, according to this, that what does Rav Yosef agree with? He agrees that if there's no actual Hanocha, the Hanocha is only contingent on Kluta. It didn't actually rest. So then we can say that although it works for the hanacha, it doesn't necessarily work for the akira. Rebbe, but in the case of Rebbe, the boy hanacha that he doesn't necessitate that there should be a hanacha al gabe zis kol shehu on a small area. Who adin de la akira, then the same is true for the akira. Sagya b'chol shehu. It's enough to have a small area. In other words, what we're saying here is that Rav Yosef only agrees that if the hanacha is not an actual hanacha, it's just a hanacha because of the rule of kluta, so then we don't necessarily say the same works for the akira. But if we find a case, and we do by Rebbe, that there's an opinion that holds that there has to be hanacha on an actual area. However, it doesn't have to be 4x4. So then the same is going to be true for the akira. If this area works for the hanacha, then the same area needs to work for the akira. And therefore, that's the first answer of Tosfos, that when we said Homani Rebbe, when Rav Yosef said it's the opinion of Rebbe, he's referring to the first case of Rebbe, where we see that Rebbe says it doesn't need an area of dalet al dalet. It's enough that it's a small area, and we say that if it's enough a small area for the hanacha, the same is true for the akira. And the Gemara then continued and refuted it, like we explained that case is a case that Abaye explains of a tree. Now Tosfos is a move to a side point. However, to the Gemara later nearby, less lay svara the Rav Yosef. We don't hold of the svara of Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef holds that by kluta we say it might work for the hanacha, not for the akira. But if there's an actual area, if it works for the hanacha, it also works for the akira. Says Tosfos, we don't hold of that. We say that if kluta works for the hanacha, it doesn't necessarily work for the akira. And if hanacha on a small area, if a small area works for the hanacha, it doesn't necessarily work for the akira. How do we know that we hold that? The Gemara didn't ask that over here. We didn't respond. We only see about the hanacha, not the akira. So Tosfos, the paracha Rebbe Zera, because nearby in the next piece of Gemara on Hey Amad Aleph, we ask on the answer of Reb Zera, who brought a case that achirim say that if a person threw an item and it landed in another's hand, he's chayev. So we see we don't need an area that's 4x4. So the Gemara says, Dilma acherim bo akiras mokim dalad. Maybe they only say that the hanacha doesn't need dalad or dalad, but the akira does. So Dilma acherim bo akiras mokim dalad. Maybe acherim require that it should be an akira from a place that's 4x4. And it's not enough to have a small area like it does by hanacha. So clearly our Gemara says that even if we see that the hanacha is valid on an area that's small and less than 4x4, it doesn't indicate that the akira will also work from such an area. So that's just a side point to say that our opinion of the Gemara is that we distinguish between the hanacha and the akira, not just when the hanacha is dependent on kluta, but even when the hanacha is on an actual area that's less than 4x4. Now we're going to present the second answer of Tosfos. It's from Rabbeinu Tam, to show how Rav Yosef could have been referring to the second case when the person threw the item from Rosh Hashanah to another Rosh Hashanah through the Rosh Hashanah. Well, Rabbeinu Tam near, and according to Rabbeinu Tam, it seems the Garsinan Bahazerik that we read later on in the Gemara in Perek HaZerik, Yosef Rav Yosef Kashile, that it's not Rav Chizdu had the question, Rav Yosef who responded, but the reverse. Rav Yosef's the one that had the question, and he had the question, and Amalei Rav Chizdu and Rav Chizdu is the one that responded to him. How does that help? The Otzi Shaper now goes well. The Rav Yosef have a masni. Rav Yosef is the one that learned Divrei Rav Yehuda out the Rebbe. Rav Yosef is the one that learned the opinion of Rav Yehuda on Rebbe. In other words, what Tosfos is answering over here is that Rav Yosef is of the opinion that when Rav Yehuda says he was Mechayev too, he wasn't referring to Rebbe Yehuda. He was referring to Rebbe. And therefore, Rav Yosef is the one that had a question, how could he have been referring to Rebbe if Rebbe is not Mechayev and told of a Mokim Av? And Rav Chizda responded, you have that question because you learn his teaching on Rebbe. But I learned the teaching of Rabbi Yehuda to be referring to Rebbe Yehuda. What this helps is that now we can say that Rav Yosef, when he said Hamani Rebbe, he was referring to the second case of Rebbe. Because Rav Yosef learns that in the second case of Rebbe, when the person threw it from one Rosh Hashanah to another Rosh Hashanah over the Rosh Hashanah, and Rebbe says Chayev, what he meant to say is Chayev Shtaim, is Chayev 2. He's Chayev for the Achanos and the Rosh Hashanah, and for the Itzat to the Rosh Hashanah. So Rebbe is of the opinion that we don't need an area of dalet al dalet of 4x4 tvachim, not for the akira, not for the hanacha, and not for the akira. So he could be referring to the second case. Now Tosfos is going to point something out. And nearby, when we ask in the later piece of the Gemara, we challenge this answer by saying, oh, that's referring to a case when there's a roof on the Rosh Hashanah, and we say based on the command the Malyadami. Damya have a matzil mifrach. We could have also asked the question Rav Yosef had in Azerik. The Rebbe le mechayev told of a makam av. That Rebbe doesn't make one chayev for a told in the place of the av. Titania, as we find, it says in the Brisa, Rebbe Omer, Rebbe says, Dvarim hadvarim, Eila hadvarim. It says in the pasuk, Eila hadvarim, and from there we learn that a person is only chayav for 39 malachas. The most carbon chatos a person can be chayav for is 39. We'll show how we see that in a moment. But from there we see that if a person's only chayav for 39, that means that if it did all the avos and all their tuldas, it'll still only be 39, because one is not chayav for a tulda b'mokim av. There's 39 avos. There are many more tuldas, and the maximum amount that a person can be chayav for is 39 chatois. So the reason is because one is not chayav for a tulda b'mokim av. The way we see it in the pasuk is because it says the extra hay of hadvarim, so that shows us that we have dvarim. Let's start from the beginning. Dvarim is 2. The extra hay is 3, and the gematria of Eila is 36, for a total of 39. The maximum number of chatayis a person could be chayav to bring on Shabbos is 39. So the difference between, I'll just explain a certain point over here. There's a difference between if Rav Yosef learns that when Rav Yehuda said he's chayav too, he's referring to Rebbe. That means Rebbe's chayav too, and he has a question on it. So then he still holds that Rav Yehuda was referring to Rebbe. So he could say that the case where we see you don't need Anach and Akir is the case of Rebbe. However, if Rav Yosef never even learned that Rav Yehuda was speaking about Rebbe, rather Rav Yehuda was speaking about Rebbe Yehuda, then we can never bring the case of Rebbe in the first place. So although in either case, Rav Yosef has a problem with learning it on Rebbe, there's a difference if he learns it on Rebbe, but has a problem with it, as opposed to if he entirely doesn't even learn it on Rebbe. Now Tosfos is going to try to prove that Rabbeinu Tam's Girsa and Azarik is correct, that Rav Yosef did learn that when Rav Yehuda said he's chayav too, he was referring to Rebbe, and he was not referring to Rebbe Yehuda. Tosfos is going to try to prove it and then say that we can't prove it. And according to the Girsa of Rabbeinu Tam is what seems correct. Tilahu Girsa, because according to the other Girsa, the Masni Rav Yosef, that Rav Yosef learns Milsad Rav Yehuda, the teaching of Rav Yehuda, the Mechayev Beis, that the person is chayav too, Rebbe Yehuda, on the case of Rebbe Yehuda. That in other words, Rav Yosef says that Rav Yehuda told us that in the case of Rebbe Yehuda, a person is chayav too. This creates a problem. Kashid the Rav Yosef ad Rav Yosef. That girsa creates a contradiction of Rav Yosef on himself, on Rav Yosef. Why is that? The Hassam Omer Behedja, because over there it says clearly, Rabba Rav Yosef, the Amritar Vayu, Rabba and Rav Yosef, the two of them say, Loi mechayev Rabbi Yehuda el achas. Rabbi Yehuda does not make one chayev, only one, except one chayev. So it's a problem to say that Rav Yosef learned that when Rav Yehuda said he's chayav too, he's referring to the case of Rebbe Yehuda, when he himself says that Rebbe Yehuda is only mechayev one. So therefore it seems to be correct that Rav Yosef did not learn that the teaching of Rav Yosef that he's mechayev too goes on the case of Rebbe Yehuda, rather it goes on the case of Rebbe. However, Tosfos says it's not necessarily a contradiction. We could respond. We could push off this proof. The Rav Yosef Mishmei the Rabbi Yehuda Ka'amar. The Rabbi, it's supposed to be the Rabbi Yehuda Mechayev Shtayim. We could say that Rav Yosef is just telling us that when Rav Yehuda said he's chayev too, Rav Yehuda was referring to Rebbe Yehuda. But he himself doesn't hold of it. So it's not a problem for Rav Yosef to say, I'm of the opinion that Rebbe Yehuda is only mechayev one. And I'll share with you that when Rav Yehuda said he's mechayev too, he was referring to the case of Rebbe Yehuda. So he holds that Rebbe Yehuda is mechayev too, and I hold that he's mechayev one. It doesn't end up being a contradiction on himself. So to summarize, we had a question. The main part of Tosfos, it seems that Rav Yosef could not have been referring to the first case or the second case, and we presented two answers, one showing how he could be referring to the first case, and one showing how he could be referring to the second case.